Thanks so much for being here. So Kelly, I've heard you talk about how from a young age you would strive to be different and maybe even defiant in that. Do you think that part of your character, that piece of your character, is part of what led you to being someone who would question the status quo when it came to Western medicine?
Yeah. So, I think my story is probably one that most can relate to, which is that there is this deeply repressed essential self. And then there is the curated, will you love me? Will you finally accept me? Am I worthy hologram, that we project to the world. And just like almost all of us, I worked from a very early age to begin to learn how to gain acceptance and meet the needs of my parents in betrayal, really, of my own understanding of myself and my own needs. So that tension was, I think, based on childhood experiences that sent my essential self really deep into the basement. That tension was really, really taught. And as I, began to become a professional in my medical training and whatever else, I was like always in trouble and constantly, it was like getting called to the principal's office practically in my residency. I'm like in my 20s, I'm not a kid anymore. And I've always had like this really kind of like, my parents would call it like a smart mouth, right? Like a big mouth and always trying to get the last word. But then I also really always tried to kind of follow the rules and always to be beyond reproach. Like I never wanted to be caught red-handed, or I never wanted to be blameworthy. So it's like this paradox of fundamentally challenging the constraints that were placed on me and also being afraid to defy them, to move beyond the pale. And so I think it's really like in our 30s, but maybe in this moment in time, it's happening for more and more people, no matter what age they are. They could be 70, they could be 18. But I think classically it was like, in our 30s that hologram would, I think, begin to declare itself, and we would start to recognize that tension and begin to feel like, wow, no matter what I do to curate my life, I'm still going to feel like a fraud. I'm still going to feel that hollowness. I'm still going to be chasing like that oasis on the horizon. And so I think, it was really just that volcano erupting, to mix metaphors, in my early 30s that was pretty irrepressible. And it's a shadow aspect of me, which is like a know-it-all, like I know better than you or you to tell me. That actually in that way served me because I was pregnant. I remember at the time treating pregnant women, medicating them.
Yeah.
And I was working with an OB who was, I'm sure, a very nice, kind woman, well-intentioned woman. And I just started to like challenge her on some of the science of these interventions, anatomy and ultrasounds and C-section and whatever. And there was, we kind of like our vibe went rank at that point. And that was the beginning of me saying, you know what, I'm going to do my own damn research. And leaving the obstetrical field generally, finding a midwife, and ultimately pursuing, natural medicine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's these defenses serve us up until a point, but that very same defense is like the worst nightmare for my husband. You know what I mean? Like, so it's at a certain point, they need to be transformed into their adult version, I guess.
Yeah. And your story is really interesting of how you ended up recognizing that this is something you needed to pursue because of your own needs, right? I mean, your own diagnosis after
I think that's common. I think if you look at the MDs in America who have gone rogue, especially those who've gone radically holistic, it's because of our own experience with the limitations, the low ceiling of that model. When I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is, potentially a chronic autoimmune condition, I knew I could have written my own prescription. I knew, what I was looking at, and I wanted to opt out.
Yeah.
So I had to walk away from everything that I had learned in order to pursue the quality of life that I intuitively knew was available outside of the system.
Yeah. And when you did do that, when you kind of broke free of that work in Western medicine, there had to be a lot of fear around that, a lot of worry about abandoning your original career path and transferring over to this new one. What was that like, and how did that work out for you? How did it pan out for you?
Well, it's kind of like any breakup, right? If you think of the breakups that didn't leave your heart in a puddle on the floor, it's probably because you were pissed as hell, right? So like rage is a balm in this kind of a transition. And I wasn't afraid at all. Quite the contrary, it was not something I could choose to ignore. And I felt only relief every time I took a step in the direction away, from my training. And those steps, were really paved by science, because I'd always been, very interested in science. I had, thanks to my conventional training, I had learned, how to, and specifically my training in medicating pregnant women, I had learned, how to look at research and assess its quality. And so I kind of went back to PubMed.gov and started to figure things out for myself. And every time I learned something, new that I hadn't been told, or every time, I was working with a naturopath at the time, and I went, to get labs done, and I saw my antibodies normalizing, and I thought to myself, well, no one ever told me this was even possible, let alone that food was relevant, or, that our whole conceptualization of chronic disease might be just one version of the story. I was enraged. Kind of like a hot-headed Italian, Irish, and I was really enraged, and it felt like a betrayal, because what happens is we identify these institutions and project, the good parent onto them. And I had parentified the medical institution and thought, well, obviously it knows best. It's going to guide me and all of my patients exactly where we need to go. And I had chosen to put my trust there.
Right.
So, some say that betrayal is just waking up to something you weren't willing to see before. And I think that's a very apt definition, because that's exactly what happened. I felt betrayed by the system I had invested blood, sweat, tears, debt, into, but it was always my choice. I just didn't recognize that as a choice, because we are presented the dominant medical orthodoxy as the only option, not as one of many choices of belief systems to adhere to.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I'm glad you made it through that. Here you are.
And you having been on the inside, did you experience doctors prescribing things to their patients that they wouldn't even take themselves or give their own family?
That's a great question. I actually think that it's more common that doctors are so enculturated that they too participate. I know that a lot of my residency classmates, for example, were also on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines and sleep medicines. I know that most of us were raised taking antibiotics, at the slightest cough. Yeah. We were part, and you still are part of that kind of a worldview that looks at pharmaceuticals as a benevolent offering to minimize suffering, So I think it's only now that there are clinicians, including in the field of vaccinology, who wouldn't participate in the kind of medicine they're offering their patients, who are kind of subtly in that awkward place of saying, well, it's right for them, but not for me. And that was my experience. So maybe I was on, the earlier edge of that, where when I was looking down the barrel of taking a prescription for the rest of my life, I thought, well, it's fine for my patients, but I don't want to do that, so that emergent hypocrisy was ultimately revealed.
Yeah. And I have friends that are struggling with whatever maybe they have an ailment, or maybe they're having a hard time getting pregnant, whatever it is. And they're reaching for answers in Western medicine for that, and kind of closed off to any other options that might be available. And I think, once you get down far enough into that realm and you figure out, okay, well, this isn't working now, I have to finally decide to look elsewhere. That's one route to it. But is there a better way that we can ask people to come up against their dissonances when it comes to that way that our culture has sold us Western medicine is the only way for so long? Is there a way to ask people to remove that dogma,
So I wish everyone could come with us, and they're just not coming. That's kind of the difficult news. And many of the people probably listening would characterize themselves as kind of the black sheep in their family, because I built an entire community of black sheep, and myself included. And my family's not coming with me. And it's taken me years, to develop a sense of sufficient individuation where I can let them be their own people. And I don't need them to share in my reality for my reality to be valid. So that's a part of becoming an adult, right? It is really allowing for other adults to live in their reality and not needing that, what's often referred to as emotional symbiosis, not needing it to be totally fused in order for it to feel safe, But I've come across and referenced this Greek word, which is anamnesia, I love it, because in my understanding of the definition, it means the remembering of something once known. And I think it so characterizes the sensation that has been described by many at this point, with me running my mouth for many years, when they hear this kind of information, and it's almost like, oh, of course, it makes so much sense. I knew that, right? It's never, almost never, oh, okay, Dr. Brogan, I've read all your references and I see you have a point, and I'm willing to participate in what you have to offer. It's almost never that. So far from it being an information-based transmission, it's simply awakening this innate, I'll call it wisdom, but maybe it's just kind of a compass towards a more peaceful, expanded version of reality than the constricted, fearful version that individual is inhabiting, right? So they're magnetically pulled to this new understanding, this new place that is predicated on a truce with the body, right? So in this new place, the body is not a machinery that breaks down or is rife with inbuilt errors, or that ultimately you have to subdue and suppress. The body is an expression, maybe even of your soul, right? The body is holding the energy of emotional conflicts, according to, prominent psychoneuroimmunological researchers like Dr. Candace Pert. This is now being reified scientifically, what I think so many people, and especially artists and creatives and visionaries, they just kind of get it already. They just kind of know it, and it makes sense to them that the body would be this elegant. And so to have a scientific framework to support that intuitive knowing is kind of the cool moment we're in.
Yeah. And what is natural medicine in your terms, and maybe what is the science behind it?
So I think of healing, right? Like we hear this word so much in the zeitgeist we're in. It's like everyone knows they've got to heal. They don't know how. They're going to choose a lane. To my mind, healing is a process of self-discovery. And I think that is the defining feature of what I have described as really a spiral path. So it's like, you revisit over and over again these patterns of victimhood in your life. And whether that's in relationship, in relation to your body, whether it's professionally, whether it's in your parenting, there are over and over again these points of pain, rage, shame, tension, anguish that are presenting to you a familiar dynamic, bringing it up for transformation. If you are ready at that turn of the spiral, you will move towards it with empowerment and radical responsibility, and you will rewrite your story so that your body no longer has to experience that particular pattern, right? If you're not ready, that's okay too, because it'll come back around and you'll have another opportunity. And so as we do this, if we are oriented towards our life experiences, whatever they may be, as being rich with opportunity for us to understand ourselves, right? As the writers of our own narrative, as the creators of our own reality, then each of those experiences is just a moment to learn more. That's it. And so it's really a path that I think drains fear away. And that doesn't mean you can never feel fear again, of course, but it means that ultimately you grow an adult consciousness that comes online, that is always present and always able to soothe that ancient emotion, right? Because the fears that we have and that we feel, we like to think are universal. But what's interesting is that, those are assumptions about the objective nature of emotions. And it's highly, highly, highly individual. The things that really bring us to that terrain of existential angst are very, very individual. So I don't know. I think natural health is ultimately a process of supporting that self-discovery journey rather than interfering or imagining that we are at odds with literally anything that's happening.
Yeah, and you say that you're so articulate at putting that all together, and that piece of the psychology that comes behind, like whether we're willing to let these other options be something we will entertain, is maybe it's about taking away the taboo around the way our minds work, being in fear of how our minds work and being in fear of diving into our own psychology and figuring out how we do look at medicine and how we do look at wellness in our own body, or what that means to us, or why we choose, we have to eat a certain way every day and be rigid about that, or we don't choose a diet at all. And then we, end up suffering that consequence as well. And in that, when it comes to the different diets that people use and the different reasons that they use them, the different dogmas they might subscribe to through their diet, even like veganism. It seems to be almost a religion at this point. How do you go about navigating that, like with your patients, when they might be prone to one diet or the other, and you know that that's not probably the healthiest option for them?
Yeah. So, we've spoken a lot so far about some of the psycho-spiritual tools, I guess, that would attend a healing process. But I'm a big advocate for, the kind of, I call it chopping wood, carrying water, like very, very, very basics of a self-care routine, and engaging your power of choice, which I often, conceptualize as being the greatest human power we are offered, in this lifetime, to commit to a discipline. And, my protocol is 1 month long, and it turns out that amount of discipline can be life changing, right? So what are the components of this month protocol? They're based on my own healing experience and my understanding of the scientific literature. They're very basic. The intention is to send the nervous system a signal of safety. And the way you send the nervous system a signal of safety is on all those simultaneous layers, right? So it's on the physiologic layer, where you minimize inflammation, you maximize nutrient availability, and you eliminate, the addictive foods that are and drinks that are yo-yoing you around, including your blood sugar. Then there's the psychological layer, which is arguably the most important in my opinion, which is, how do you create a ritual for the experience of your own power and control over your, embodiment, right? So this is a ritual that is different enough. It must be different enough from what you are doing that it disrupts your default mode network, your autopilot brain function, right? And so that's why, most healing programs that have an impact, that's kind of what you're doing, right? You're not doing 10 of them. You're not, maybe just trying it out. It's an investment of your energy and attention, and you are given a sense of control where formerly there was a sense of helplessness and overwhelm, right? So that's the, psychological layer. And then, maybe the spiritual layer is dissolving your former identity so that your essential self, as I referenced earlier, you can make contact with that. Right. And if you thought that you were a vegan, as many of the people who come to my program do, right? Maybe you thought you were a vegan. I remember one patient who said, I used to think I was a vegan, what did she say? A vegan, a liberal, and that I was destined to be a school teacher. And now I have no idea who I am. And, that confusion, that identity dissolution is the hallmark of rebirth. It must accompany. Because if it's a smooth kind of like, oh, now I'm a little interested in this, then you're just going to be a little interested in that. And you're going to kind of like squish around the various offerings in the wellness space for the rest of time and skirt your own awakening potential. From my perspective, and I'm sure, this is a generalization that could be proven wrong. But from my perspective, it requires deconstruction, and for myself and for most of the patients and course participants I've worked with, it's hard and ugly, and so the diet part, it's really just an offering that you give yourself so that your nervous system is at ease, your physiology is balanced, and then you can recruit that witness consciousness in the moments of when your old stuff comes up. So that you can relate to yourself differently, so that you can really begin that self-discovery process without brain fog and blood sugar instability and bloating and, all of the rest that attends eating a diet that's not right for you. Now, it's important that I came upon a diet that I think is right for people who have, who are struggling with depression principally, diagnoses like ADHD or generalized anxiety, hypothyroidism, multiple chemical sensitivity, allergies, and autoimmunity. This is not the diet for everyone. In fact, my mentor advocated for 12 different diets that were subtly different from, eating fatty red meat twice a day, every single day, all the way to never eating red meat, right? So there is a spectrum. In my mentor's absence, since he passed in 2015, I have found that it works to use this template for 1 month. And after that month, you get in touch with your own preferences, right? That kind of intuitive compass comes online, because he also always said, and I feel like he kind of gave this to me as a subtle, offering back when, he always said, patients will want to eat the diet that heals them.
Hmm.
So that means you actually like the food that you are meant to eat to heal. It's what you want. And that's why so many of, the vegans and vegetarians that have come to my office, when I would say, listen, this diet that I'm recommending is very permissive of grass-fed red meat. How do you feel about that? And they would light up like a Christmas tree, that I would give them permission,
right,
ultimately. And that's not to recruit, the ethical aspects of consuming animals and all of what might come into play there. And I've had many, many courageous women work through the spiritual nature of that transition, invoking Native American consciousness and some of those indigenous folks before us who have templated what it is to have a sacred relationship to the consumption of food. I don't pretend to be any sort of expert in that. I struggled with it myself. I was an ethical vegetarian before I, was pregnant. So I get it, and I don't need to speak to that at all. But from a physiologic standpoint, I know that a red meat containing diet that is restrictive of a lot of foods like legumes and grains and processed sugar is a very good complement to the what he would call the parasympathetic dominant nervous system. So the kind of nervous system imbalance that is very common in these individuals. And that's why I think it sets the foundation for the rest of the journey.
Do you think it's also the calling of essentially their microbiome, their gut bugs that are trying to have that communication, the gut-brain communication of, here's what we need. This is the colony that currently is existing here. And if you can nourish us, we can help you have a good, a healthy immune system and do all the
Which
processes.
can be a thin line because some people crave
sugar, yeah,
and alcohol, and they think, well, my body must want this for my healing. But that's because
that's a psychology.
Yeah.
Follow your craving.
With natural medicine, for me, a lot of it is common sense. Whereas the people who find it unethical to not vaccinate your children, they want to argue science. And so how are you able to, I guess, kind of meet them where they're at? Because they feel like you're endangering them by not vaccinating your children,
Yeah, when it comes to public health, we get into the very thorny fields of belief systems. And what is dangerous is when we don't recognize that we are working with belief systems. And, Rupert Sheldrake, for example, is a scientist who has really called out the current practice of science for its use of scientism, which is essentially the religious appropriation of science, to be used as a belief system without its being recognized as one, and instead being asserted as an objective tool for the determination of truth. And that's a very dangerous concept because any scientist, any researcher knows that science is a process. There's no destination. It is always iterative, right? So I have become, very, very passionate about the concept of informed consent, because I think it's really the only place where we can land, given our radically different perceptions of reality and the different stages that we're all at in terms of working with our shadows, right? Because it might seem like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? But it's my perspective that when you have not done shadow work, by that I'm using Jungian terminology. By that I mean when you don't understand that you are running from your own inner badness and you're desperate to believe that you are ultimately, the person that your personality suggests you are. And you're not the liar, the cheater, the murderer, the child molester, the thief, that those are all bad things out there who belong in jail, right? Then you're going to be very susceptible to germ theory, which suggests that there are invisible little bad things out there that come and get you from other bad, sick, dirty people, right? They come and get you inside you and they contaminate you and they need to be beaten into submission.
Right.
This is the most childlike psychology that is not substantiated by contemporary science, according to me and many of my colleagues, who have allowed this hundreds of year old perspective that it, does not account for the microbiome, does not account for epigenetics, doesn't even account for the discovery of DNA. Vaccine science is over 200 years old and has not been advanced or progressed, right? So this is a relic, but it's really a psychological relic and one that betrays the immature psychology that says bad things are out there that need to be destroyed because I am fundamentally good, right? And instead, an adult psychology allows for what's referred to as the mixed object, right? So allows for things to be both good and bad and actually fundamentally meaningful and non-random.
Right.
Right. So in this world, my body, interacts with the environment, and what seems bad could actually be good. What seems good could actually be challenging, right? There is that level of nuance, right? That belief system is totally at odds with a belief system that is forever using force to fight the badness outside of us, right? And we're talking about germs, but you could talk about, terrorists, or, you could apply that to any technology. You could apply that same psychology. And so if we allow for these differences in belief that inform our medical choices, informed consent is the ethical bedrock for those differences to exist harmoniously. Because informed consent says it is ultimately my choice, based on all of the available information, to permit, a medical treatment, right? To allow for a medical treatment, of course, one that penetrates my body, right? Let alone the body of my child. And so if we adhere to that ethical tenet, then you always have a choice, no matter what. And there is not anything that supersedes that. And so, I think if we can get back to medical basics, we can restore that, and then we can begin to perhaps really allow for the true exposure of some of the science-based, the indicting, that the science has the capacity to do of the modern practice of vaccination when it comes to safety and efficacy. Because right now we're in paralysis because of the default assumption that this is an urgent intervention that should supersede all other considerations, including ethical considerations. But once we kind of secure that, then we can actually take a fresh look at what the science has to say, so that people can actually make informed choices. And thankfully, despite Google algorithmic suppression of, those of us who are trying to get the word out, thankfully, I do think that a tipping point has already been reached, and kind of everyone already knows someone who knows about this. So I actually think it's a bit late for censorship.
Yeah, and I think that's great that, the fact that we're having the conversation right now, I guess, speaks to the fact that it's getting out there, this is a way. And
it's a scary thought.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. And the whole Google censorship, maybe you can speak on that a little bit, just because I think that a lot of people don't know what's going on there.
They think if they do it, they're going to get the answers,
right?
But they don't realize how it's filtered.
The opposite.
Yeah. I don't know how they would know if not listening to this kind of conversation, right? Because it's, there's been a little bit of media about it, but it was basically in June of this past year, there was an algorithm put into place that effectively treated as fringe any alternative natural health websites that provided information like the information we're discovering. And so me and about, I would say 40 of my colleagues found ourselves dropped off of organic search. So what that means is that whereas I might have been a first page result that I have, diligently, without any capital or anything, just over the years made sure that I answered questions that people were actually asking about, let's say like the gut brain, maybe an article that I wrote would come up on a first page search. Now you literally cannot find my articles unless you put my name in, right? So that's not how people search for information.
On the timeline, if someone were to post it.
Yeah, so you can, interestingly, you can go to Google Trends and you can actually find not only, kind of how these things have dropped off, the site visits, et cetera, like we've lost almost all of our organic traffic, but you can also see that what they are auto-populating the search result with. So, if you put in like vitamins and it might come up, synthetic or whatever, like things that people actually search for. But now the auto population of those search phrases is inconsistent with what people are actually searching for. So they're engineered. So it might be vitamins, it might be deadly, maybe that's not a great example because maybe people are actually searching for that. But there are many instances in the vaccine realm where people are absolutely not, or GMOs, for example, people are absolutely not searching for, you can see from the Google Trends that they're not searching for this, and yet it's coming up as a suggestion.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think that, and there's actually been quite a courageous whistleblower who's potentially risked his life to come forth with the agenda that has been going on behind Google's closed doors, because they apparently believe that this is the best way to keep dangerous information from the American public, right? So perhaps there is a good intention behind it, but it's like I explained to my daughter, who's 10, I said, it's kind of like if you're going to the library, right? But you think it's like a normal library and they're going to have a collection of books and, you know, you're going to look around, but instead it has the outside of a normal library, but it's actually the librarian's favorite books only. So it's only her favorite books. But if you're perusing and you don't know that, then you could miss out on like a ton of books that could be really important for you. And if you knew it was the librarian's choice of books, maybe you'd go to a different library, right? So once we know this information and you know, I no longer use Google as a search engine, you know, you can go to DuckDuckGo or you know, new ones will be born. I know that. And that's the kind of silver lining of this is like the transparency era that we're in, like you can't get away with shit anymore. And because of that, you know, there will be fertile soil for, you know, conscious entrepreneurial efforts to meet the needs of a free informational economy. And I do think that that's going to be born of this.
Yes, I'm all for that authenticity. I'm all for that transparency. So because you deal with mainly women, how much do our hormonal cycles come into play when we're talking about mental health and physical health in your work?
Yeah. So in my practice, I have treated only women. So I have a good amount of experience with the role of hormones. I know nothing about hormones in men. Don't ask me about that. But so, you know, what's interesting to me is that so many of the women I work with have been treated with birth control pills over their lifetime. I myself took them for 12 years because I had kind of an insider knowledge biologically. I knew that I didn't even have to bleed, that it was like a false cycle. So I even continuous cycled. So I pretty much took birth control continuously for 12 years, stopped birth control, got pregnant like a month later, right? And then was pregnant and breastfeeding for the following, God, I don't know, 5 years. So I was like into my late 30s before I actually had a natural cycle that I could even recognize as something to learn about. And I don't think I'm that unique. You know, I think this is relative now. And so as, you know, as somebody later in life, I'm just beginning to work with the rhythm of my, you know, biological energy. And this is not to even go into the territory of how we're related to the natural world and the moon cycles. No, right? This is literally just the hormonal relevance of your having at least 4 stages in 1 month that you are ultimately, you have different levels of energy, you have different levels of creativity, your brain is functioning in different ways, your emotional signatures are going to be different. If you don't know how to work with that, you're functioning with a handicap.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, right? And so because we are coming out of an era of feminism, egalitarian feminism, where we, myself included, were so invested in, you know, I can do what you can do bleeding kind of a psychology, like I'm just as good, if not better than, you know, any man. And I'm going to show you by basically, you know, neutering myself by basically, you know, eliminating any evidence of my femininity. We're coming out of that. And thankfully, we're coming into a deeper understanding of how our relationship to our bodies is ultimately a source of tremendous advantage and power. But healing that energetic cycle over the course of the month does, in my experience, require the same layers we were talking about. So understanding, you know, how your physiology is reflecting to you hormonal imbalance, right? So, you know, I had a patient, Allie, who's very public with her story, who was so psychotic before her period that in several of the cycles, she was like digging a hole in her cheek, thinking that something was like in her cheek. She was suicidal. She had, I think, 5 very serious suicide attempts, multiple medications, multiple hospitalizations. Within 2 cycles, she was physiologically balanced, right? And in her case, we also recruited a detox strategy I learned from my mentor called the coffee enema, you know, now notorious coffee enema. And so, you know, it was from that bedrock that she could then begin the psychospiritual process of healing as a woman, right, and learn what it meant for her to reclaim herself, right, from all of the ways that she gave her power away, right, over the course of her lifetime. So I'm a big believer, again, in that chopping wood, carrying water, and understanding that, you know, you don't have to take 700 supplements and progesterone and all this stuff. First, get the basics on lock: meditation, detox, diet, and conscious consumerism. So making sure you're not using hormonally disruptive products, cleaning products or cosmetics.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're also a Kundalini Yogi. How has Kundalini had an effect on your journey with natural medicine?
So it's so interesting because I don't know if you know, there's a huge controversy exploding in the community right now, indicting, the teacher Yogi Bhajan who brought Kundalini over from the East to America. And so I've been really immersed in that. I just finished a book called Premka on the subject, like an expose, right? Bit of a Me Too kind of an expose, but I think very beautifully presented. And so it's interesting because I never really fell into the, like, I've found my religion that some people literally do with Kundalini Yoga, where it's conflated with Sikhism. And so some people really do take it to that level, and I'm sure it served them. For me, it was like a revelation that I could actually get anything out of meditating.
Mm.
That's why I ultimately became a teacher, because I knew that I wanted to equip those people who know that they needed to meditate probably more than anyone else with a means to have like a micro experience quickly, right? Because I'm the kind of person who I'll sit down to do a mindfulness meditation and literally come out feeling worse, right? Self-flagellating, like what's wrong with you that you can't even sit for 10 minutes. You got to like think about what you need from, Whole Foods, or like the 4,000 things you forgot to write on your to-do list, or, oh my God, I need to call it. And that would be the detritus and the garbage in my brain would just be revealed to me. And I actually had that experience in yoga too, like vinyasa yoga. I would go in, I would do an hour, feel like it's good for me to have done it. And I would leave feeling worse emotionally and psychologically because I just spent an hour with my trash in my mind, and I had no discipline over it. I had no capacity to tame it. And so I found that the practice of Kundalini, which invokes many different things, so often like hand movements called mudras, or breathing patterns that are somewhat complex, like 8 sniffs in and then 1 long one out the mouth. Your eyes sometimes have to look in a particular direction. And sometimes there's something that is physically challenging, like holding your arms up for, 11 minutes or whatever, that ultimately has the capacity to train and tame the mind for that small moment so that you can have a little bit of contact with that emptiness. And for me, it has really worked and gave me the opportunity to develop a daily practice that I think ultimately rewired my nervous system so that I no longer experience fight or flight the way that I was chronically resting in.
And I've heard you also speak about a randomized trial where they're using yoga as a means to help with OCD specifically, right?
Yeah, so this is my colleague, David Shanahan, also such a wonderful, heart-centered, brilliant man. And he has been doing this research for a long time, trying very hard to get a lot of it published, and he succeeded in mainstream journals. And yeah, in this particular study, there was a 70% remission rate of OCD symptoms. And if you know anything about the pharmacological studies on OCD, they're really pretty sad. Like 23-30% remission is pretty typical with the use of antidepressant medication. So, my thought, of course, this was in the rage and indignation phase, was like, why didn't I at least hear about that, even to be dismissed, as some like quackery or what? I never even heard. I should know about this one study with this outcome, because it's so far surpasses what's otherwise available for, something that many people struggle with. So yeah, powerful tool.
Powerful. So there's a few short questions we like to ask everyone who comes on the show. Yeah. So if you could hug your younger self right now, what would you say?
I would say you were right all along.
How old were you when you were hugging yourself there?
Like 6.
If you could have the whole world read one book, which would it be?
And not mine. No, I'm kidding.
We recommend all those.
It would the whole world read one book. Okay, I'm going to give a plug to my friend Charles Eisenstein, and I would have them read a book called Ascent of Humanity, which I believe is a book that he channeled. It's huge. Unfortunately, it's like 600 something pages. And it's basically like, you know what you know, but here's another version of the truth about everything. So it's Ascent, like ASCENT of humanity.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, very important.
And if you could whisper one phrase to everyone on the planet, what would it be?
Thank you.
So before we let you go, where can people find you online?
So I'm over at kellybroganmd.com, and we have lots of free information and then tools, for your level of readiness as you travel your spiral.
Thank you so much.
This was amazing. And I just want to tell you that the work that you're doing is really changing lives. I'm sure you already know that. I'm sure you get all kinds of response from your community, but it's changing our lives as well. So we're just really inspired by your light. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. It's because you're remembering what you already knew.
That's good.
You already are.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take care.